First thing you're going to need for this cutting board is some hardwood. I'm using walnut, purple heart, and cherry for mine, but you can use any hardwood. So first, I'm going to plane these all down to the same size because they were cut-offs. So I'm using a planer for this because all my wood was cut-offs. If you have wood of approximately the same thickness, you don't need to do this step. Now I'm going to give all these boards a light sand to make sure they're tight in the glue up. Now I'm going to rip all these boards into strips at the width I want my cutting board to be. So if you're just going to make an edge grain cutting board, which is perfectly fine, that'll be your total width of the cutting board. So if you want it to be like a thick 2-inch cutting board, that's not 2 inches, 2-inch cutting board, or if you want it to be thin, you can do that. I'm going to make an end grain one, so this is just going to be the thickness of the squares on the end grain cutting board. Now you're going to flip all of these so that they're on, the edge grain is on top and the face grain is all facing each other. And then that'll mean that the edge grain is going to be on the cutting surface. And then you're just going to arrange these in the order you want that makes it look the prettiest. So the next step is, after you've figured out your arrangement, is you're going to want to wipe all these down with acetone, if they're exotic wood, to get rid of any oils that might be on them and to bring out the color. You're probably going to want to wipe them down to get rid of the dust first, which I already did, but then you're just going to apply these, put them in the acetone, put it in the sun, and just let it wait for an hour. So you can see the coloring on there, that's all the oil that it wiped off. I'm going to let these sit over dinner and then I'm going to glue them up. Alright, I'm going to use Titebond 3 to glue these all together now. You're going to probably want to use parallel clamps if you have them, otherwise you can use bar clamps. You don't want to use squeeze clamps because they don't have enough clamping force to really get the bond that you need. So I'm going to glue these on, brush them to cover the whole surface, and clamp them together. You're going to want to be really liberal with the glue because you can plane it off later or sand it off later, and you want it to be really tight fit. So I'm wiping the extra glue off right now so there's less cleanup when the glue dries. You're going to want to let this sit overnight and it should be completely dry in the morning. So I let this sit overnight and it looks like this now. I'm going to clean up some of this glue, squeeze out, and then send it through the planer to flatten it. So I cleaned up some of the glue with a scraper, and now I'm going to plane it to make it flat. You can just use a sander for this, but I'm going to plane it and then do a light sand just to make it faster. Now I'm going to do a quick sand, and after the sanding you could just leave it like that and trim off the edges and use it like it is, but I'm going to try and make an end grain one, so there'll be a couple more steps involved. But if you want to just make an edge grain, you can sand it and skip the next step. So now I'm going to trim the edges on this table saw sled that I made, and then I'm going to cut this into sections to stand up on end to make the end grain cutting board. Alright, so I trimmed off the edges and this is looking really great. You can just leave it like this now if you want, but I'm going to go a little more fancy. So you can just ignore the next step if you want to leave it like this. Otherwise, you can make yourself a stop block at however thick you want the cutting board to be. Cut this into little sections at that distance, and then we'll turn them up and glue them together. Alright, so you can figure out a design you want, and then you can just glue it up and let it sit overnight, and then sand it in the morning. And don't forget to wipe the dust off your pieces before you glue them up. So I let this sit overnight. Now I'm going to take it out of the clamps and clean up some of the glue squeeze out. I'm not going to scrape this one because it's end grain, and so I can't go with the grain with the scraper, so it's just too hard to do. So I'm just going to sand both sides flat now. So I finished sanding each side, so it should be flat. And now I'm going to trim each edge with the crosscut sled to make sure that they're even. Alright, so I finished cutting all the edges, and now I'm just going to do a quick sanding of all the edges and knock off the corners with some 80 grit sandpaper just by hand. Once you're done sanding with the 80 grit, you can do as much as you or as little as you want, and it's very customizable. You're going to take a microfiber cloth and just wipe down the whole cutting board with it to get rid of any sawdust. Then you're just going to take a spray bottle with water, spray it all over the whole thing. That's going to raise the grain, it's called. And that's when all those little fuzzy fibers will come up, and you're just going to let that dry, and then we're going to sand it off with 150, wipe it down, spray it again, and then 220, and then it will, when it gets wet, it will not get all those fibers. So after you finish raising the grain and sanded it to 220, which I did and didn't show in the video, I am going to oil it. So this is going to finish it and make sure that no water soaks in and causes it to warp or any bacteria gets in or whatever. So I'm using this cutting board oil. I'm just going to coat it on both sides. I'm going to coat it, let it sit for an hour, flip it over, coat the other side, and then let it sit for the night and do another coat tomorrow. And then I'll finish it with some wood wax for cutting boards. Alright, so I applied some oil. I did 2 coats and let it sit for a while after each one. And now then I waited a day, and now it's completely dry, and now I'm going to apply this cutting board wax to fill in all the voids and whatever. I'm going to apply a thin layer and let it sit for 15 minutes, and then I will buff it, and it will be done. After you've rubbed everything in and let it sit for a little bit to dry, you're done. Thanks for watching. Alan Does Everything.